because we're now going to start our question and answer session for this afternoon's presentation. So I will invite the other annex presenters to please remount the stage. And I am also going to invite Bob Lamb, Executive Secretary, Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, to join us. Bob is a longtime friend and colleague. Prior to joining the Fisheries Commission in 2013, he was the director of the Canada-Ontario Invasive Species Centre and former Regional Director General of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Central and Arctic Region, with responsibilities for the Great Lakes. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Michael. Like drinking from a fire hose, isn't it? So after being through 3 sessions already over the last 2 days, you kind of know what my job is. I'm to coordinate questions, make sure the right questions are asked, and to put anything that is probably better dealt with offline into the canoe locker, so we can deal with it later. So while we're actually getting the microphones heated up and so on and so forth, I thought I'd start with and within the context of making sure the right questions are asked, I'm going to pick on my my good friend Gavin Christie. So interestingly, yesterday we saw some really great presentations. And we saw, I think, an outstanding presentation that captured the indicators, right, where we stand from the point of view of the indicators. And the only one that was poor, and how was that poor and deteriorating, was aquatic invasive species. So I guess my question to you, Gavin, is what's going on, my friend, and how come you're not in the principal's office?
Well, I do spend a lot of time in the principal's office, so to be clear, I have a little pass today. That's a great question, Bob, and it is a challenge for us, isn't it? As I tried to describe, we've had some really significant successes, as we've said. But as when you look across the indicator, which includes a number of other important measures, including, of course, those terrestrial invasive species, when you bring those together, then you start to sort of take away from what are our successes. We heard just earlier in the day today, for example, about the spread of invasive species within the Great Lakes. And I didn't speak so much about that, focusing on prevention as we have been on these key invaders. But we heard about Phragmites, and of course the battle for those in Georgian Bay is a good place where when you take a look at that local site, that you would say we're not doing so well there. So it's that mix that really brings that forward. And the message, as we would say, we always like, as of course so important for us to see those successes as we think about those investments in our work, but we also have to say, my goodness, there's a big battle ahead that we need to invest in.
Sure.
Thanks, Bob.
Good. Of course, I'm kidding. There's been some great work done within that annex, and I think some of the statistics that you shared, Chris, were indicative of some of the great work that's done cross-annex, which I think is one of the themes of this water quality agreement. So I see we have at least one person at the mic. Boy, those lights are bright. I think that's Dr. Carey, is it not?
It is. Still John Carey from Hamilton. I have a question. I don't know if it's Annex 5 or Annex 10 that I'll be asking to answer it, or maybe you can, Bob, you can get one of them to answer. I was impressed by, in this meeting, and I think I said it earlier, by the dynamism that's shown in comparison to other meetings that were tending to get a little stale, and I'm as guilty of contributing to that as anyone. And the fact that most of the reports we saw started with some science assessment and the priority science that was organized to deliver on the results, and they were very results focused. And I was struck by the Annex 5 presentation that said we've got some issues with respect to different standards, and that they're going to have to be resolved, and we're going to seek cooperation, but no discussion of the science behind those standards and seeking a consensus on that and a mechanism to do that. And then I didn't see that kind of priority in the Annex 10 list of priorities. It's mostly coordination of government activities and monitoring. So I'm wondering how we can get a forum on a Great Lakes context with respect to the IMO implementation in the Great Lakes and the science behind it. How could that be generated? What group could do that? Could you folks involve the IJC Science Advisory Board, for example, who can give an independent assessment if they were given a reference to do that? Just wondering for comments, wouldn't it be useful to have a consensus on the science of that issue with respect to Great Lakes context, and what do you think?
Great question. Given that the science annex largely responds to the needs of the other annex, perhaps a good place to start is with Annex 5, and then maybe 10 might want to comment based on the answer. Chris or Lauren?
Well, specifically, I can tell you the international response to your question is essentially at the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee, which will be convening in January at IMO. There will be, and I will be chairing it, a question specifically in terms of the standards that will be used for under G8. Now, we first have to get through G8, and so 2 weeks from now, G8. G8 is the standards for type approval for ballast water management systems. And there is an intersessional group 2 weeks from now at IMO. It will go all week to finalize those standards. Once those standards are finalized, then we go back and ask for the science, shall we say. The science has already been given in regards to various portions of that. We have a number of scientists in test facilities around the world that have provided input to that. But let's be honest here, it's also political. Essentially, you have to get somewhere in the average, I get probably between 70 and 103 administrations talking. It's somewhat like herding cats, and I happen to be a cat person, so it seems to work. But that is the global context to that. So my suggestion to you in terms of the Great Lakes context, just as we've already talked, is once IMO comes back and says, okay, here's, and I'll be quite honest, what you're going to end up with, I'm quite sure, is a compromise position that indicates, well, not only this standard, but this standard and this standard are acceptable, and that's usually the way it works. And one standard will work for this kind of treatment system. This standard will work for that kind of treatment system, and we'll go from there. And that will be guidance to the technical people at the testing facilities. Then it comes back to the Great Lakes, but we don't have any testing facilities on the Great Lakes. So it is somewhat of an issue. If you in turn can convince Bob and a whole pile of people to put millions of dollars into CCIW and make it a testing facility, works for me.
Could I just follow up on that? That isn't what I was talking about. I'd love you to put money back into CCIW, but what I'm really concerned about is this is great stuff, Chris, that's happening in the IMO, and I fully support it. But if you come back and you have different standards for different countries and you're going to implement that in the Great Lakes, you need to have a pretty solid plan for communication to get public buy-in and things like that. And science is usually really important in getting that public buy-in. And I don't see the forum in the Great Lakes to be discussing those right now. I've talked to a few people in this meeting, and people know about some of they know that there's an issue, but they don't know what the issue's about. And so I think, you need to be a little bit, I hope to see some activities in the science forum that's going to support that Annex 10 work, and I didn't see it, so it's not, you're very active and good work happening, but I'm just flagging that I think that down the road, if we end up implementing different standards, probably we're going to need a pretty strong scientific case to support that and get public buy-in. And I think a group like the Science Advisory Board or the IJC or something could put it in the Great Lakes context, and they have the credibility, I think, within this binational context to support your activities. I'll leave it there.
I see Mike and Cam feverishly writing, so I suspect the canoe locker is being populated as we speak. Anything, Ram or Todd, you'd like to add to that?
No, nothing, but John Kerry was my boss. And whatever he says, he's right.
I hope that makes your trip worth coming. The one thing I should have mentioned at the outset is if you can identify who you are and your organization, if you are affiliated, it might be helpful in contextualizing the answer. So I think the lady at the far left was first, and then Mary.
Cool. So I've got a question for the Annex 10 folks. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Allison Turner. I study at the University of Waterloo, so I suppose that makes me a scientist in training. But the thing is, I'm not really a scientist like the type you're talking about. So I'm a social scientist, maybe one of these policy people. So, there's a bunch of really great, rigorous work being done, politics, communications, those kind of fields that we're using, surveys, interviews, focus groups, maybe not necessarily the numerical data that you're used to or talking about or that you get to throw up pretty maps on your screens. But I'm kind of wondering, what is the role for, where is our place, the social scientists, in this annex? So, how can people like me contribute? Because I think we have some valuable contributions. And then outside of me, I think there's some really good traditional knowledge. So how are those people involved? How is that kind of knowledge reflected? I don't really know if it's in the annex or in the agreement, but how do we make sure that's being accounted for?
Sure.
Annex 10.
So Allison, those are two excellent questions. For sure, I'll take a stab at the latter one first. So as Ram indicated, there is a traditional ecological knowledge task team under Annex 10. And Ram also indicated, I'm recently new to this role with the retirement of Paula Horberton earlier this year. It quickly became evident to me that a lot more work is needed by that task team to really begin, assessing, how TEK can play a role in the agreement, and that's one of our goals in the upcoming year. And even though it's not identified as a science priority, I think we wanted to highlight that in our presentation today. That we're hoping to really reinvigorate those efforts to better incorporate that. Maybe I'll turn it over to Ram to take the first question.
About the participation question that you asked, the task teams are fluid, and we welcome anybody who volunteers, because everybody here is a volunteer. And just let us know and send us what your interests are, and we will try to find where you will fit in within our task teams. Does it answer?
I mean, sort of. I just want to make sure that, I don't know, sometimes social scientists, we do kind of feel like token people, right? So, I mean, but we do really, I mean, it's science.
Yeah, I can understand your feeling. I'm from physics, so I also feel like a token scientist sitting here.
Yeah.
Human dimensions people are real people too.
Thank you. We sort of forget that after a while,
And maybe the only thing I'd like to offer is that I know that work under some of the other annexes, in particular some of the nutrients work in Lake Erie, are really exploring these sort of social scientist connections and trying to really understand the issue from different parameters, not just a numbers game of if we reduce phosphorus, X% from different fields, we're going to reach our target, but how can we do that more effectively? How can we get the message out more effectively? So maybe it's not just a question just for Annex 10, but more broadly, across all the work in the annexes.
Good. Quickly, Gavin?
Yeah, sorry, one quick add there in Annex 6. I mentioned risk assessments. Our risk assessments are ecological risk assessments I was speaking to, but we have carried out parallel socioeconomic risk assessments which involve human dimension characteristics of invasive species.
Yes, great point. Mary?
Mary Muter, I'm chair of Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation. I want to address the Annex on Aquatic Invasive Species. I was here on Monday for the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission meetings on Asian carp, and I hear today a different story and a big disconnect between what's happening dealing with Asian carp in the Great Lakes and what's not happening. Amazing statistic that 77% of Canadians think that Asian carp are already in the Great Lakes. That's a pretty scary number. And obviously, we've got a huge education job ahead of us. But I think most scary of all was the story telling us about the grass carp, the reproducing population that are currently in the Sandusky River. And we were told that they're going to hope to put a team together to deal with it in 2 years. Excuse me, that's nowhere near fast enough. And at one point, there was a reference that Canada should help. Well, I can tell you from talking to Ministry of Natural Resources and Fisheries and Oceans, staff and boats could be available to go down there and fish those fish out of the Sandusky River. And let's get them out now. We heard about prevention. We have the tools to do that. Let's put that action plan in place. I'm from Georgian Bay. We have the highest quality, most diverse, most extensive wetlands anywhere in the Great Lakes. Those grass carps will rip those wetlands apart. We do not want them in Georgian Bay or anywhere else in the Great Lakes. You need to put together a team, and I think Canada, Ontario would help, get into the Sandusky River with electrofishing boats and get rid of that reproducing population. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. That's an excellent point and a very, very important detail of the conversation and the presentation that I put together for certain. Those animals are there, as you say. There have been identification of some reproduction, which is a real cause of concern. And I can tell you that the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee and the state of Ohio, the state of Michigan, and the other states and parties, they are also very concerned about the issue and are taking it on. Your urgency and sense of urgency is a message we'll send along. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary and Gavin. This gentleman to my right.
Hello, my name is.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. As you know, under programs and other measures in Annex 10, number 1, use adaptive management as a framework for organizing science to provide and monitor the effect of science-based management options. With respect, the parties haven't really shared a robust adaptive management story with us. And taking a cue from the U.S. co-chair, Cam Davis, I'd like to know what the party's adaptive management story is projected to be for 2019 or 2021. Thanks.
You want to handle that from a CSMI perspective?
Yeah. So, excellent, point. And adaptive management is clearly identified as a key concept to be used throughout the agreement. I think we heard quite clearly from Tink and Sue earlier today about how it's going to be used in the Annex 4 structure. I think the real quick example for Annex 10 is the CSMI process by which we identify priorities. We do those assessments to address those priorities and learn from those, and those priorities then are adjusted on a 5-year rotating cycle.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Could you also speak to adaptive management as it pertains to traditional ecological knowledge?
At this point, no, I can't. As I indicated, we need more work on TEK, and that's something that we're hoping to reinvigorate over this next 3-year cycle.
Thank you. Now this gentleman.
Hello, my name is Jim Fott. I was born on a Great Lake. I was educated at a university on a Great Lake, and I've lived and worked on 4 of the Great Lakes over my career and life. And I've actually worked on the 6th Great Lake that I call Lake Nipigon for a couple of years. So it is a Great Lake, Lake Nipigon. Sorry to screw up your 5-year schedule. I have 2 questions, or actually 1 question and 1 encouragement. The first question is about citizen science. In a former career as Executive Director of Ontario Nature, we were able to coordinate the largest citizen science effort in North America, which was the Breeding Bird Atlas of Ontario, both for Volume 1 and Volume 2. Over 2,500 volunteers spent hundreds of thousands of hours on their square in the spring counting birds. I implore and ask you, why don't you use citizen science more in the Great Lakes? With the sign in the other room saying there's 5 million visits by sports fishermen, there's recreational boaters, there is commercial fishermen, there's people who live along the shores. I encourage you and ask you, why don't you use citizen science more in the Great Lakes for all of the annexes? So I'm not sure who would answer that.
Sure, I'll take the stab at that as well. It's an excellent point. Citizen science is a powerful tool. I know in my realm within EPA, that is something that we are always considering and looking at, different innovative technologies. Now smartphones can apparently go out there and determine whether or not there's a HAB in your local waterway. So I think there's definitely a role there. And I think we should be looking at using it more. I think you're exactly right.
And the model was certainly to have scientists from government and non-government organizations coordinating it so that there was valid science being collected. The second, go ahead. You had a comment?
There are some experiences with Ontario organizing lake partnerships, for example.
Yes.
And some of those things are being considered and it will be incorporated. And also citizen science is coming up in our new science plans that we are trying to develop for the Great Lakes. So it is coming, and not to the extent that you wanted to see, but it is there.
You have to start someplace, yes. The second point is about traditional ecological knowledge. As a consultant, I worked with Ontario Power Generation on the Lower Matagami. And term and condition 31 of the Lower Matagami 4 dams that flow into the Moose River into James Bay, for the refurbishment of that, term and condition 31 said that traditional ecological knowledge had to be given equal weight with Western science knowledge in both the redesign as well as the continued monitoring of that. So that was a very powerful condition in that environmental assessment and approval of that project. So you might look to that as a model for how maybe to make sure that traditional ecological knowledge is given equal weight with Western science knowledge, because it can be. Knowledge is knowledge. What the fishermen collected off these lakes prior to the seaway opening is very valuable knowledge for you to sort of gather into a database that would be used forever and before those people pass on. And there's many ways we can gather. Even the waterkeeper this morning with his stories about the eels. There's many people who can give you very accurate science information, and knowledge is knowledge. So let's gather as much of the traditional ecological knowledge that we can, not only from indigenous peoples, but also from all lake shore people who work on the lakes and visit the lakes. So that's just my encouragement. So I'm certainly glad to help with that.
Yeah, I say thank you, and if you could send that term of reference to us, I'd appreciate it.
I'd do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This gentleman to my left.
Thank you very much. My name is James Wagner. I'm a manager with the Métis Nation for Ontario Lands Resource and Consultations branch. I'm also a member of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board. Thank you very much for putting this on. It's been absolutely fantastic. My question, it touches on a number of annex topics. So it'll be interesting to hear from the panel. It relates to climate change, invasive species, in particular Phragmites, the science aspect of things, as well as from an earlier presentation from this morning about the phosphorus loading of Lake Erie. About 6 weeks ago, I attended a meeting in the prairies, a climate change meeting out there, and a gentleman by the name of Dr. Hank Venema, who works with the Prairie Climate Center, delivered a presentation. And of course, the prairies are seeing the impacts of climate change as well. Very similar to Ontario, increased storms during the transitional seasons, dramatic reduced time or frost period. So what they're experiencing is, as well as the phosphorus loading getting into the lakes and creating the algae blooms there. One program that they've instituted that they're starting to find tremendous successes in is known as the Lebeau Nutrient Bioenergy Project. And what they're using is cattails at point sources to absorb the phosphorus before it gets into the water systems. And they're then letting the cattails dry, they're collecting them, converting them to biofuel, and the ashes remaining are phosphorus, which they then sell back, which is much more controlled for the farmers. And speaking with, our leadership and elders, within the Métis community, they themselves say they use cattails around their, around their septic systems, and that you can actually drink the water, just steps away. On the other side of the cattails, you can drink the water. My question to this panel is, what on the ground, solutions, are the United States and Canada implementing today? And have you considered, working with other North American jurisdictions on what they're doing to combat against invasive? Because like Phragmites, sits in habitat that's prime for cattails. Again, my question is there's great science and great reporting, but what on the ground? I think we've talked enough about climate change. What on the ground solutions are currently happening right now around the Great Lakes?
Thank you. Tricia or Jen, is there anything you can talk about to get us started on that?
Well, and maybe if my invasive species colleague Gavin might want to chime in. Thank you for bringing that up, because I know that's a fantastic. I was actually just speaking with a colleague in Lake Winnipeg Basin about that project and how successful it's been the other day. So it's a good one to point out. I guess from a climate change perspective, the work under this annex has really been focused so far on gathering and sharing science and information. I think a lot of the on-the-ground action to address climate change, from a Canadian perspective, we're looking at, our government nationally has announced a huge amount of money for new infrastructure investments and a lot of money to go to municipalities to undertake climate change adaptation measures. And so, we've announced in 2016 $120 billion for infrastructure investments over the next 10 years, and a significant portion of that is going to be specifically for green infrastructure. And I know it's not really the type of on-the-ground projects that you're talking about, but things like improved storm water management and maybe even the creation of wetlands to allow for improved resiliency to climate change, all of those things would be eligible under that national funding. So it's not specifically a Great Lakes climate change on-the-ground action pocket of money, but there is money being allocated to do this kind of work, and the programs and the projects that we would want to do in the Great Lakes Basin would be eligible for funding under that.
Gavin?
Sure. The invasive species problem is one that's global, for certain, and so Chris could speak about and is involved in thinking and learn globally about shipping, for example. So we're bringing science all the time from what is around the world, and our colleagues that work on the science of invasive species meet globally to bring those pieces together. On a very practical basis, for example, our folks learning how to catch Asian carps as we look to detect them go south to the Mississippi and work with people there who are doing the work and actually catching the animals, so that we have an idea of how to make that work effectively. We just heard a great story on Monday, a good example of our colleagues with the United States Geological Service meeting with folks, a delegation in China, who are working actively to farm and fish the animals for food, Asian carps that is. And so they're bringing those techniques and technologies here to our practical problems, one of working with the invasion front on the Mississippi River, for example. So a couple of good examples of on-the-ground work related to invasive species.
Jen, did you want to quickly weigh in?
Sure. On the U.S. side, that's available. I would direct everyone, if they're interested in the actual stories, case studies of the work that we're doing on the ground, is to go to climate.gov, or more specifically, toolkit.climate.gov. This is a U.S. site, but it's open to everyone. The information that's available on there is free. It has extensive information, programs, toolkits for coastal communities to use to increase, what they're doing for adaptation and making their communities more resilient, and lots of case studies about work that is happening on the ground, green infrastructure, all sorts of work that we're currently doing. And so we're hoping to share that so that it can be duplicated in other places.
Thank you, panel. So sorry to keep you waiting, sir.
Not at all, not at all. Name is Charles Hazel, SOS Great Lakes. The question, I guess, is there are two comments and then the question. And it has to do with, I guess, the evolving nature of your organization. You observed that there are founding documents in 1972 and 78, 87, and then most recently 2012. And along with that, you're developing a huge body of knowledge about the individual lakes and their catchment areas, the 5 lakes and their catchment areas. And it seems to me that each one of the lakes, and particularly when you look at that map of how they're doing, are evolving or come to you, arrive at, for your consideration in very different states of water quality. Lake Superior, for example, is doing well, notwithstanding a number of very important issues, and then Lake Erie is not doing well, it's poor. And I was wondering, as you increase your knowledge about these on a technical and administrative level, management level, and you start to implement policies and strategies and invest in them quite differently, do you see these lakes evolving into quite separate ecosystems, in a sense, given the occupation of Lake Superior in terms of population is quite different and relative to its size than Lake Erie? Are they becoming distinct as well, and will continue to be treated as that? And the question would also be, are you looking to achieve the same quality of water in each of those lakes? Is there a commonality about your goal, given their, what I would suggest is their separate evolution?
Anybody on the panel want to start?
It's clearly not vessel discharges.
Just,
Right.
yeah.
Having said that,
canoe?
just on that, certainly we've had a lot of information from DFO Science to support the very fact that they are ecologically separate, and in terms of any ballast water and that sort of stuff, we are considering them as separate entities.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the only thing I would add to offer is it really depends on sort of the issue you're looking at. There are many different stressors facing each of the Great Lakes. Some of them are the same stressors on each lake. But if you look at just the lower food web, there are given some of the stressors like dracaenid mussels, some of the lakes are actually becoming closer from a lower food web perspective. Ultra oligotrophic like Lake Superior, Lakes Michigan and Huron, and even certain parts of Lake Ontario are moving that way. So I think it really depends on the issue, but about whether or not we see lakes evolving into separate ecosystems or sort of acting very similar. The one thing that strikes me is I'm continually shocked at how quickly the lakes can change. And I think that's really the important nature, is that we continue to understand how they're changing and why they're changing and what we can do about it.
I would add to that the politicization of each of those ecosystems. The dynamics of consultation are different in Lake Erie and with the industries there, as opposed to Lake Superior, where you're going to be compelled to have an increased level of discussion with First Nations. So there are those things to look forward to as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if I can speak from a fisheries perspective, the lakes are very different, that's for sure. So it really depends, I think, on what element you're looking at, what kind of an indicator you're looking at. We certainly see very distinct differences from lake to lake from a fisheries perspective. So I think you really kind of have to drill down and figure out, look at what it is specifically that you may be looking at in terms of figuring out whether they're evolving separately or as a more connected system, I would suggest. Yeah, some people have been waiting at the mic for a while. So this gentleman right here.
Thank you. I'm going to echo the theme of tokenism by way of introduction. I'm Lee Wilbanks, the Upper St. Lawrence River Keeper. And so we like to say we're the exclamation mark at the end of the Great Lakes. We're here to occasionally make a point. And I did want to add, this is really to the Annex 5 guys. Thank you, Lauren and Chris. And it's probably going to go in the canoe locker. But first, a footnote, I think, to your slides with the really major spills that happened around the world. The St. Lawrence River, 1976, the NEPCO 140 spill. At that time, the largest inland oil spill in America, 300,000 gallons. I can't do the conversion to tons. But even 40 years later, that's an indelible mark on a good stretch of the river, and it changed the way a very rural, very conservative, very industry-focused community looked at the industrialization of the river. So my two questions, which probably do go much longer into discussion, is there taking into account the different dynamics, the different environment that exist in the river, like the St. Lawrence, as opposed to the lakes? And are the mitigations or the prevention technologies being looked at that may be needed to be different on a river like the St. Lawrence River? And then the second one is, we've seen several proposed pipelines that will go through tributaries that are quite near to the river, and we also have infrastructure, rail infrastructure, that in some cases can fail. And so even though there's no crude currently going on the river, we do have refined products, there is the likelihood of crude going very near the river and having the opportunity to enter through some, not necessarily shipping transportation, but through some other means.
Well, Lee, I would say I would agree with you that there's certainly greater risk of vessels coming to the seaway. Much of the Great Lakes has a very forgiving bottom, and the seaway doesn't. So whether or not, if oil starts moving in large quantities on the Great Lakes, that's going to have to be a decision, a risk management decision to make if there's going to be extra requirements. I know there's some precedent around the country for certain areas. There's additional requirements. So again, if that happens, that's something that I think we'd all be looking at. So, I mean, the regulatory regime right now, especially post-Open 90, is pretty extensive with respect to double bottoms, et cetera. But I wouldn't rule it out. But part of that's going to be a political decision, I think, as well, if that happens.
The only thing I would add is Canyon-Slack actually over the last 3 years has looked at, interestingly enough, shifted completely away from in their exercise, has shifted an oil spill from a tanker to oil spills from shore. So in that respect, as I indicate, the last one worked with Enbridge, which is a pipeline company. Shell has asked to be part of that for the next one. So that is definitely a concern for Canyon-Slack and the people that are doing the planning for these emergency responses.
Thank you.
Thank you. John.
John Jackson, and probably for the purpose of this question, I should identify myself as a Canadian advisor to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, which Bob is part of, and also a member of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, and they've added something else onto it, forestry, I think. Advisory Committee, Stakeholder Committee on Lake Ontario Fishery. And what I want to raise here, and I'm not sure we can get a clear answer, but I think it's something we have to start looking at more seriously, and it really comes out of Gavin's presentation. And he showed the ways in which things have gotten introduced into the Great Lakes Basin. And a big chunk in that, it was, I don't know what the percentage is, but it was not a small bit, it was a big chunk, was the stocking of fish in the Great Lakes. And I never hear at the water quality agreement procedures, and I participate in tons of them, as many of you know, the discussion of what does stocking mean for the health of the Great Lakes. I do hear those discussions on the advisory committee for the Ministry of Natural Resources. I hear those discussions at the Fishery Commission, but I'm not sure that takes care of it, because I'm not sure that the balancing of the factors that we would use to make decisions about stocking are the same if we were looking at it purely from the perspective of what's in the water quality agreement and the objectives of the water quality agreement, and when we're looking at it from the fishery perspective, which is what the Great Lakes Fishery Commission is, and they try to make the adjustments to deal with that, so I'm not condemning the organization at all, Bob. But I think that we know that the stocking of fish has had huge negative impacts on many of the lakes, has disrupted the food system. And I'm not suggesting we should have no stalking. That's not it. Being on these other advisory committees, I know how horrendous it is if you get into that discussion. But I'm not sure we're doing the balancing of the factors that are important in terms of protecting the Great Lakes properly unless we start thinking about it from the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement perspective as well. So that's my comment and question. I don't know if Gavin or anyone has anyone to say about that, but I'd really like to see it looked at seriously.
Thanks, John. It's a great question and an important part of the story. The graph that we've used is non-native species, as you point out. And you note there's a green bar in the middle that are those species that have been introduced. Some of them we take for granted today. Let's see, a brown trout, for example, brought from Europe and now naturalized. European carp as an example of a fish. Some of these we could turn the clock back and we'd perhaps tell a different story, as you say, John. Importantly, if you look at the changes in that, there are very, today, especially in the context of the Joint Strategic Plan for Great Lakes Fisheries Management and in the context of what is introductions of species, there are critical and very specific bars that are questions that are asked around that. And I can say today that in none of the fishery management agencies or fish community objectives for the Great Lakes would include stocking of new species, you would say, John. So that story, we would say, is done on the part about new species. And then the other piece of the puzzle, and purposely included alewife in my slide about historic invaders. You'll recall that the Pacific salmons introduced into the Great Lakes were introduced at a time when there were not, when all was lost essentially. Lake trout, the top predator, and the pelagic were gone, extirpated from all the lakes except for a bit in Lake Huron and in Lake Superior. And so the alewife and prey and food web were completely out of balance. Those Pacific salmon in their original entities were actually an early case of biological control. So I agree that the story today is one that we really do need to take on, and it's in a number of different fora. The Habitat and Species Annex, for example, examining native species, deals with that to some degree. But in the context, it's a very interesting observation around native species, and today you'd say that route has been cut off today.
It actually is a comment that I was going to make if I had time at the end, in that I think that for many years the fish community objectives were pretty fish-centric, I would say, and because the water quality agreement is multidimensional now, it has paved the way for ecological objectives to be built into the fish community objectives. And we've seen more progress on that in the last 2 years than we did in decades before. So I think it's an excellent suggestion, John, and it's starting to happen. I think we'll see leadership on two of the lakes in particular in the next round of fish community objectives in 2 years. I think this gentleman over here has been waiting for a while.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mike Ripley with the Chippewa-Ottawa Resource Authority in Sault Ste. Marie, and I'm also on the IJC's Water Quality Board in the role of the U.S. co-lead of the Emerging Issues Work Group. And I just wanted to talk a little about what the Emerging Issues Work Group is doing. We were hoping to have some sort of announcement here at this meeting. But our main issue that we've been working on is climate change adaptation. And last year we commissioned a report on jurisdictional assessment of what's going on around the Great Lakes as far as climate change adaptation and resilience. And what we found was that there is, it widely differs from municipalities to states and provinces. Everybody is trying to address climate change adaptation and resilience, but in much different ways and in a lot of different capacities. So as a follow-up to that, we did a workshop in Windsor this summer. We had experts there looking at not only the report that was commissioned, but also to give advice to the work group. And we did come up with recommendations. We have yet to put together a report, but one of our main recommendations, and I should mention that, our background is from the annex, from the climate change annex, and all of the things that you all talked about today that will and is happening in the Great Lakes right now, the extreme rain events, the increased temperatures. As a matter of fact, during our workshop in Windsor, we had a catastrophic event in northern Wisconsin where people lost their lives and millions of dollars in damage in catastrophic flooding. And that's not, of course, not the first time on Lake Superior. Duluth had a 500-year rain event. Wawa had a rain event where it washed out the Trans-Canada Highway. So these things are happening right now, and climate change adaptation is something that needs to be addressed. And our prime recommendation to the IJC, because that's what the Water Quality Board does, we recommend things to the IJC recommends things to the governments. But we are asking for a binational approach to climate change adaptation. We need coordination on both sides of the border to give the governments advice. We're purposely not being prescriptive, but to leave it up to them, but some sort of a binational approach to adaptation in the Great Lakes. And also an assessment, what exactly is the damage being done or possibly in the future the damage, and how can that be addressed? So among other recommendations, and like I say, we'll have a report. I'm hoping that the commissioners will announce that at some upcoming time.
Okay, I saw people taking notes. I think that point's been registered with both the parties and the commission. So so thank you for raising that. I'm cognizant of time here. We're actually out of time, but we have two people that have been at the mics for a while. So if we can make the questions quick and the answers quick, we'll, with the chair's grace, we'll do that, and we'll have to wind the session down. So I think Mark's been here for a while.
And I'll be very quick. Mark Matson, Lake Ontario Waterkeeper. And I tweeted out the study if anybody wants it at Waterkeeper Mark. But this year, one of the most concerning studies that I saw all year long was done by the US EPA. And it was the US EPA Protection Agency's 2010 National Assessment of US Coastal Waters. And for the first time, it covered the Great Lakes. And 157 samples were done on fish. And of those samples, and I'll just go into a few of the concerning data, but it said the study found that less than 1% of all the fish sampled were below what would cause adverse effect to wildlife. And 80% of all the fish sampled were above cancer causing for human beings. And they looked at PCBs and PCFs. And this was in 2010. And it was only done for the first time in the Great Lakes. It was released in 2015, in February. And the Canadian side didn't participate. So I guess my question is, this seems shocking. You think it would have rocked what you would have had to say today about in terms of the impact and the health of our fisheries and fish and wildlife. And I'm wondering how it influenced your reports this year, and whether or not the US EPA and Canada is participating in more of these studies going forward in the future, and if they'll be released earlier than after a 5-year period. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'll tackle the last one quickly. Yes, those are studies that are planned to go out into the future on a 5-year basis. The states and EPA were out in 2015 sampling. I believe there was some sampling done in Canada from the University of Windsor on Lake Erie. It wasn't part of that report, but that's something that I'd be willing to help track down some of that information to find out where it stands. And this is a study that's coordinated out of EPA's headquarters office in DC. And I would say it's information that's going to be used and informative for sort of addressing the nearshore framework under Annex 2. And I'd be happy to have any follow-up conversations with you in the interest of time.
Thank you. The lady to my left.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Sandy Greer, and I feel compelled to follow up on Charles' questions about the possibility at a future time that the work that is being done for the Great Lakes may become fragmented again and politicized, and people would start doing work separately instead of continuing to work together. And I think that what we're talking about right now and what we're dealing with, it's not just the Great Lakes project, but the project of this historic moment is the evolution of human consciousness to understand how integrated our lives are with all planetary life on the planet. So we must be very cautious that we don't think only in terms of intellectual, analytical science, and why, in the most profound way, the teachings of Indigenous people are to be heard at this moment. I have never, in 30 years of working with Indigenous people, I used to be a journalist focusing on their issues through many years, I have never been in a setting cross-culturally where I have experienced graciousness and respect by people in my own culture towards the Indigenous speakers instead of cutting them off or not really appreciating the message that was being attempted to communicate to the rest of us. Because I feel that the Indigenous peoples are here partly to remind people in Euro-Western culture that we have focused for several centuries too much on the intellectual mind and not enough on the human spirit and soul and on how much our emotions and our physical bodies impact on everything that we do, how we behave, how we understand our interactions, not only with each other, but with all planetary forms of life. And so this is a beautiful moment of possibility for us to really appreciate that we must go forward. And in terms of ecological awareness, it's really also a spiritual awareness of the wholeness of everything and how we all are a part of that wholeness. But each and every one of us has uniqueness. So it's like having the perspective of an eagle. And the eagle has a twofold perspective. It is the perspective that the eagle flies high and very close to the Creator and sees the whole picture in its unity, but also has a particular type of vision physiologically that the eagle can also zero in and see minute details that are very important to the deeper understanding as well as the expansive understanding. So it's how we need to evolve our consciousness to hold both the depth and the expansion and to understand the wholeness with that kind of incredible beauty. And so I really want to thank everyone. Like I want to thank the people in my culture that are showing respect and graciousness towards Indigenous people. And I want to give my most profound thanks to the patience and the compassion and the generosity of Indigenous people who keep waiting and waiting for us to wake up and join them, for us to, in terms of truth and reconciliation, we are here to learn from each other and to heal the earth at this time. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the interventions that have been made over the past couple of days have been very powerful, and I think the impact of those interventions were reflected in the co-chair's comments, and they may want to comment again. I'm sure they will, probably in closing. But your point's very well taken. Do we have time for the one more question? We have a speaker who's been at the mic for about 10 minutes. Can we make it real quick?
Yes, or I can also, it's related to Asian carp. So Gavin, if I could catch you after this, I could just ask you directly. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll dispense with my closing comments and just say thank you to the panel, and thank you to everybody for just outstanding presentations. I can't believe how well you distilled all that information down. So thank you.